Hello, welcome to the video for Lab 9 in CS115 on JavaScript user-defined functions. This is a super important concept in programming. It really opens up a lot of possibilities for us, so I'm going to jump into it. I have my outline here with the different things I'm going to talk about, and we're going to start with a brief overview of what is a function. Then I'm going to talk about the different tasks in the lab and go through the solutions to them. I'm going to program them as you watch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this video into multiple parts so that the individual parts aren't super long in and of themselves. I'm going to do what is a function in task 1, then I'm going to do task 2, then I'm going to do task 3 as separate videos. All right, so what is a function? A function is a way to store and recall code, right? You can compare it to like a recording where you're like, oh, let me record this conversation, later I can play it back. And I can play it back again and again and again and again, no matter how many times I want, right? So it's something where we don't want it to take place immediately. We want it to be recorded and happen later. And the analogy I really think is useful is a recipe, right? That's something from our everyday lives that we've all sort of experienced to some degree, right? Using a recipe to cook food, or maybe if you're a chemist, using a recipe to synthesize a chemical formula, right? But a function is really like a recipe in that it stores a series of instructions, right? So we write down instructions in our recipe, bake it at 350 degrees for 30 minutes, mix these ingredients in this order in this way. When we're writing down the instructions, we're not actually making the recipe. Or maybe we're doing it as we're making the recipe, right? But those two things are separate things. And then later on, we can pull the recipe out of our recipes book and actually make it. And we can make it again and again and again. And if we're good at cooking, we can make it with precision and repeat it, and it's delicious every time. And so a function is like that, but for code. So right now, all the code that we've written up to this point is code that basically is running as soon as the page loads. When the page loads, it pops up some alerts and some prompts and does something, and then it's done and finished, and the web page sits there and is sort of dead. But now that we are going to be able to define our own functions, we're going to be able to take some code and set it aside and say, oh, we want to use this code later. And then there's a way of saying, let's create a button in HTML so that every time the user clicks this button, we will run this function, right, based on the name of the function. So when we define a function, we give it a name, just like a recipe has a name. When we call the function, it's called calling when we want to sort of repeat those instructions. Do that stuff. When we call the function, we sort of say its name and then put parentheses to say we really want to do this now. And that allows us to repeat that thing, and we can attach that function name to an HTML button, an input element with type button, and that will allow the user to basically trigger that function whenever they want. And so this really enables us to do more modern web pages where instead of you load the page, it pops up all this stuff. If you want to do the stuff again, you have to reload the page. To be a web page where you load the page once, it has some inputs and a button. You write something in the inputs, you click the button. You can click the button again to get new results. So that's a high overview. Here on my screen, you can see an example of the syntax. We write the word function in our file, and then the name of the function that we want to define, and then some parentheses. We're always going to have a comment right before the function that sort of has an explanation of what the function does. And then we use these curly braces, like with an if statement, to sort of tell JavaScript, hey, whatever is between these curly braces, that's the code I'm telling you to save for later. All right, so let's go back over here to our lab webpage. That's the basics. I'm not going to go over these reminders, but we'll get to them as we go through the different parts of this video. So download that folder, and I'm going to start with this task 1 here, so we're moving on. Time elapsed. Write a function to report in the time elapsed HTML web page the number of minutes that have passed since the start of the current day. Okay. So this day is 860 minutes old. That's what it's supposed to do. And we gave you a time elapsed.html file. Here I have it open in my browser. And here in Atom, I have the HTML file. And if we look at this HTML file, it's got a header up here with title and stuff. Okay. Here's the body. It has a header for minutes passed, has a paragraph. Here's our input, type equals button. Value, so the value is what appears on the button. Find the age of this page of this day in minutes. And if we look here, find the age of this day in minutes is on that button. And then on click, let me scroll to the right here. The on click value is calculate minutes since midnight. Maybe I will move this down to another line so I can read it more easily. Okay, so this is saying when the user clicks this button, this is what should happen, right? And now that we have functions, then we can essentially assign a name to a section of code. We can then use that name to say, oh, hey, trigger that name in this circumstance. All right, and then we have a div here with the ID is the results ID. And it says put your result into this div. So that's where we're going to end up putting our results at the end. All right. So here is my timeelapsed.js. You'll notice the last thing in the HTML file is a link to that script. So that script is going to run at the end of the page when it's all loaded. Right? But we don't want to actually do anything at that time, except we need to define this function that's going to be called later. So the first thing I'm going to try, and I'm going to do this with all my functions, is just say alert hi. Just like pop up an alert, the most obvious thing, I want to see if the function actually works like I'm expecting it to. So I'm going to save that, go back over here to my browser, refresh this page, and click the button. And hi, I see it there, right? So if I take that code out, go back to what it was before, and refresh the page, and click the button, nothing happens, right? Now, if I have no code at all in this file, or like maybe I have the wrong file name or something, we'll see the same behavior. Nothing happens. However, if I open up the console here, refresh the page, it's a blank console, click the button, I see an error. Whenever something doesn't work the way you expect it to, particularly like the first step, you try to put an alert that says hi, you click the button, it doesn't pop up, the first thing you should always do is open up the JavaScript console and see if there's an error message. Because an error message will tell you something broke. And it often tells you some useful information about what broke. In this case, it's saying calculate minutes since midnight is not defined. Okay, that seems like we tried to call a function that doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist, right, because I deleted it from here, or I commented it out. If we define the function but don't have any code in there and run it, click the button, nothing happens and there's no error, right? Which is a weird situation to be in because you're like, it doesn't work, but it doesn't tell me why. And in this situation, I strongly recommend add an alert somewhere in your code, in your function or outside your function. Maybe I'll put an alert, ho, ho, ho. All right, now I'm doing two things. I am storing some code for use later that will pop up an alert, and I'm immediately right now popping up an alert. And we can see the difference between these two is this ho 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 pops up right at the start of the page when that script is run. The hi never pops up because we didn't actually run that code yet. We stored it for later. When I click the button, bam, hi, button, hi, button, hi. So that's the first thing that you should sort of be playing around with and making sure that works. Make sure that your JavaScript and HTML files are linked correctly, your function name is defined correctly, all of that stuff. For this first one, we've given you files that should already be linked, but it's good to test it. Make sure you open up your console to see if there are any errors popping up. All right. Go ahead and get rid of these alerts because I don't need them anymore. Let's actually write some code that does something. So going back to our instructions, when the button is clicked, display a message based on the number of minutes in the day so far. So I'm going to go ahead and make a var minutes equals, I don't know, something. I don't know. It's going to be complicated, but we'll worry about that in a second. Let me figure out this displaying on the page part first, because that part should be fairly straightforward. If we have a var message is the day is, what does it say? The day is this day. Okay, I'm just going to copy paste this so it's exactly the same. Not terribly important, but And then 860 obviously is not always correct, so I'm going to put a, wow, doesn't like my quotes. All right. I'm going to put a variable in here, minutes. This variable I just defined. Maybe, you know, not question mark. I'm going to put 17 minutes. So, okay. We have a minutes variable. I'm going to worry about that later, right? And then we have a message variable. The day is that many minutes old. And then we're going to put that message on the page. How do we do that? That sounds like a document.getElement by ID. And then over here, what's the ID? Results ID. So this is where I want to put it. So results ID dot inner HTML. Right, so I'm grabbing this element. Maybe I can do a variable var result div is that thing, and then result div dot inner HTML. So here's the thing. I'm storing it in a variable. I'm going to take the inner HTML of that variable, so whatever is inside it, replace it with a new value, which is going to be my message. All right, let's save that. Go over here and run it. And click. The day is 17 minutes old. Appears on the page. So that's cool, right? It doesn't appear when we refresh the page. Instead, it appears when we click the button. We've stored that code for later, and then we've said when the user clicks this button, we run that code. All right. 17 is not really correct. Otherwise, I would have posted this video earlier. So let's actually calculate the number of minutes in the day. It sounds like I'm going to need to deal with a date. So var now equals new date. That's going to give me the current day and time. And maybe the minutes could be now.getMinute. Is it getMinute or getMinutes? I don't remember. I'm just going to assume, and if it's wrong, I'll figure it out because there'll be an error message. Plus now.getHour times 60, right? Number of hours times 60 plus number of minutes. I think the hours are already in 24-hour clock format. Should be the number of minutes since midnight at the beginning of the day. Let's run it. Click it. Hey, error, getMinute is not a function, right? So that was the thing I said. I'm going to try it and see. Maybe it's getMinutes plural, getHours plural. Let's try it. Hey, that did something. 13:57 minutes old. If you can figure that out, you know when I'm recording this. Right now, so it's actually 10:37 p.m. by my clock. So 10 o'clock is actually 12, right, hours in the morning plus 10 hours in the evening. So 10 plus 12 times 60 plus 37 is 13:57, 13:57, good, right? We can use JavaScript as a calculator to double check our math. So that worked, I think. We can refresh the page. Oh, it just ticked over to 10:38. So let's click the button. I'm not even going to refresh. I'm just going to click the button, right? And it updates this message. So every time I click, it's going to run that function for me, which is pretty cool. Which is a new thing that we are able to do now that we can define our own functions. So that's my code for this calculate minutes since midnight function. We get the number of minutes by doing hours times 60 plus minutes. You know, if I had gotten these names wrong and I couldn't get them right in a few tries, I would just Google it, right? Look for the reference material on, I would Google like JavaScript, date object, get minutes, and it would be easy to find. And then we made a message out of it, a string, and then we took that message and we put it into the page, right? Equal signs, moving information from the right to the left. That is our first custom function. We said, define this function, remember this code for later. And then in the HTML page over here, we said that this input is a button, and when you click it, that function is what code to run. And that's the sort of magic of user-defined functions. I'm going to break this video here and create a new one for the birthday wisher so that the videos aren't too long. Thank you for watching.